Hello, welcome to another training session on CSS. In this video, we will be looking at CSS layouts, continuation from our previous video. In our previous video, we talked about display property and float. We looked at the type of display property that we have, talked about the new kind of display property we introduced. We introduced the inline block and then the none. We also talked about float and clear. We were able to use float and clear to create a layout, a CSS layout, and by just using some few properties, which are float and clear. This will allow you to move an element to the left or to the right, and once you are done, you clear those elements so that other elements can just start afresh. When you call a float, it makes all elements, wrap around it in line with other elements. So to stop that behavior, you need to use the clear. Details of that is in our previous video. Moving on to what we are supposed to do today, which is positioning. CSS positioning is in line with what CSS layout is all about, and it allows you to position any element to any part of the screen using with the help of positioning, or rather CSS position property, and top, bottom, left and right. We're going to be going into coding so that you will be able to see how you can make use of this, and also use cases for the use of all these type of positioning. We have like 5 different kind of positioning. We have the static, we have the fixed, sticky, relative and absolute. We're going to go through all these type of positioning and you're going to see their use cases. The first one we have here is static. Static is really a giveaway. We will not be doing so much there because every element by default on an HTML page is presented to you in a static form. So what we've been seeing so far, what we've been using so far is static, even though we don't declare it. By default, every element display in a static form. So this one is cheap. So we have 1 down and 4 to go. Next one is the fixed. As the name implies, it allows you to fix an element to any part of the screen that you want. It allows you to fix an element to any part of the screen that you want. With the help of the fixed, the positioning property, and top, right, bottom, left, you will see how these 4 properties will come into play to create this effect that we want to display. And the fixed property is also very good for when you want a message to be displayed constantly on the screen without it being affected by the scroll behavior of the browser, by the user scrolling away. You want it to be fixed. There are reasons why you want to do this. Maybe you want a notification to be displayed to the user and you don't want the scroll to affect it. You want to, so majorly that's one of the reasons why you want something to be fixed on the screen. So without further ado, let's go into the code and see what we have. Okay, so I've prepped this for us where we can have a larger font screen. Let's go to the code and say we have a page, we have a div that is supposed to have a content which we want to fix on the screen, and I want to say this is a warning. That's what I want to be fixed on the screen. By default is display as static and nothing is happening. So I want this other thing on top to serve as the content of the page. So I can say this is the top content, and I create another content on the bottom. This is the bottom content. So the idea is to show you what happens when you have a fixed page. Another thing I want to do is also to create a way whereby we can demonstrate the scroll effect. So what I want to do is I want to increase the body here, the height of the body, to something that will allow me to scroll through the page. So I'll go right in here and have our style, I'll style our body, provide the height property to, let's say, 1000. So 1000 won't do it. Let's say 6000. So you can see with 6,000 we're able to scroll through the page. So this is to demonstrate if you have multiple content on the page and you want to fix an item. You can see by default is static, so they go ahead with the flow of the page of what you are doing. How do we then make it fixed? So let's create a separate class so that we can attach this fixed class rule to this particular section that we want, which is the warning that we specified there. We'll go ahead and style our class name. First of all, we want the position to be fixed. So immediately you specify the position property, you get to see all the 5 that I made mention of: absolute, fixed, relative, sticky, and static. So those are the 5s we'll be looking at. So we choose our fixed, and immediately you can see that it's already contending with the item that we have there. But let's just style it a bit more so that it can be obvious. But let's change the color to red. Let's give it a border. Let's also give it a background. And we have this. So notice what you have. You have your item this way, and you can see that the third item is overlapping on it, and that's the point of what the fixed is all about. It stays on top of every other thing, irrespective of how you scroll. So immediately I start to scroll, so you can see your screen, and you will notice that it's going away. Those other items are going away. So once you try and scroll back up, it will always come in that location. So let me create a kind of a margin so that we can have a better view of what it is. So let's create more content. So let's create more content on the top as well. So you notice that your item is pushed down. It starts counting immediately you specify the fixed. All these other paragraph push the fixed elements down until when you declare the fix, and it stops, and it starts fixing itself on that part of the page. So notice the distance from the top to where the fix starts, and that's equal to the number of content that you already have here by default, because we already stated that the content should start from the top here, and it's taken into consideration that you already have like 4 paragraphs here. That's why it's starting at this initial stage. Of course, where you want your item to be really depends on you, and there are other properties that allows you to do that. Remember, it's not only position that we have that allows you to do this. We also have top, left, right, and bottom, which we will also be looking into now. So the only thing that we'll specify is position. You have other things that can help you position this item properly, because right now it's just based on the flow of the item. Because once you have all this paragraph, it then sees that the next thing is fixed, it starts fixing it from there. It won't fix it from top, it will fix from the last known location, which is here. That's why it's fixing from here. You might want to put it on top here, or on the right, on the bottom. I will show you how to do all that now. The way to do it is to specify these 4 properties. I'm going to comment them out so that we can then see how to use them. We have our top in any order, by the way. We have top, we have left, we have bottom, and we have right. You don't need to specify all of them. You can specify the one you need, and it will be applied to the page. So let's specify top and see how top works. So let's say you want to put this warning on top. What you then need to do is to specify that from the top you want to start from 0. What that means is that, because the idea is that the position of what top is the distance between the item and the top of the screen. So you saying top is 0, it closes that gap from the top and the element. So anytime you scroll, that item is always located on the top. And you can do quite a lot. You can say 20, providing your unit of measurement. So if I do 20 pixels, you get to see that. So let's do something interesting. Let's use percentage. So if I do 10%, so where we are now is 10% of the screen. So you can see what's happening. This is 10% of the screen that we have. So if I say 50%, what do you think? It will go to the 50% of the screen. So every time our item will be there. What happens is whenever you specify top, left, bottom and right, it changes the default disposition of where it's supposed to be in the flow of it breaks itself out of the flow. Okay, let's try and work with other attributes that we have, the other properties that we have. And by the way, this property also works with other parts, other type of positioning. This is just the first positioning we're working on, which is fixed. We're going to work on the other ones, and in working with other ones, we're still going to work with top, left, bottom and right. So take note on everything I explain here is applicable to other parts that we'll be also be working on. So we'll specify top. You can specify that, okay, you want it to be shifted to the right, or from the right shift it to the left. You have various ways to move around this. So if you specify top, you don't necessarily need to specify bottom anymore, because you are saying from the top you want 50%. You don't need to say from the bottom you want another another value, because you are picking your point from the top. So no need to specify top and bottom. You could only specify one place from top to where you are, or from bottom to where you are. So I could do bottom 50%, and I'll always have something like this. So it's also from bottom I get this. So you could either specify top or bottom, left or right, either one that you want to do. So this means using bottom, and to make it start from the bottom of the page, you could then do bottom 0. What that means is that it will take you to the bottom of the page. So you can see every time you scroll, the fixed item will always be on the bottom based on what you specify. And let's go back to, let's say, top 10%. Let's use 20% rather. And let's see how to work with other parameters that we have here, which is left and right. The same way top and bottom works, the same thing happens to left and right. If you want to move your item from the left to push it to the right, you just specify left. Right? So how much do you want to push from the left to the right? So let's say 10%. If you do 10%, what do you expect? You expect your item to move 10% to the right. So if you say 50%, you're expecting it to stay somewhere in the middle. So that's what you have right there. You could also say that you want your counting to start by the right, meaning you want to start moving it from the right. So if you change this to right, you can say 0 here. What that does is that it makes sure that the right distance from the item is 0, so it pushes it to the right. That's what the right item does. You can also do the same thing to left. By default, left is also like this. You start from 0. Notice the difference between you specifying left and not specifying left. You not specifying left uses the position of the parent element, which is the body. The body itself is being pushed where it's being pushed 50 pixels to the right, and that's why you have it on this part. So if you want to override that, you have to come and specify your left that no, you don't want to use the container where it's been existing before. You want to use your own default setting, and you specify your left, it then default here. Same thing happens to right. If you want your right, you default there. So you will always use left or right, top or bottom. You might not have to combine both of them together, or else you just confuse the browser and the browser will just pick one of them. So you use top and left together, or you use top or bottom, left or right. That's how it's being used. So that's everything for fixed as we have now. Let's go and see what we have next. Next we have sticky, but we'll take relative first. so that you will understand the flow before we go to sticking. This property allows you to position elements relative to its normal position. So what that means is that the normal position of an item, when you set its position to relative, you'll be able to alter it from its normal position. It will just use its normal position as a reference to where it should be next, where you're trying to position it to. So just take an item where it is. When you say it is relative, it will just use its understanding of where it's supposed to be to plot the next course of where you need to put it next. So that's the best example to use for relative. So let's give an example. Let's go to see an example of what we have. So I will put an element in conjunction. I'll put another element here, which is a paragraph, and I will say hello. I will just say top elements, and I will say bottom element here. Then here I will say relative. I will say relative content. Remember the definition of relative content. So let's put every item to have a kind of border so that you get to see, you visualize what we have here. Now that we have this set, let's make this only applicable to body. Okay, let me make this applicable to paragraph and divs. So this is more manageable. So we define relative to allow you to put your content where it is without distorting it, but it will adjust based on the known position. Let's now set our position to be relative. Nothing happens when you do this, that position is relative. So if you don't want to change the content, the location, that's fine. You can set it relative. And you will need to know where you need relative in the future when we go to the other types. Other types depend on the fact that the position of their parent needs to be relative before they can work the way they are supposed to. Just know that for now. But the important thing you need to know what relative is all about is that they will not move until you specify their location, top, left, and bottom. They will go with the normal flow of your web page. Let's increase the body so that you can see as we scroll that it doesn't have any effect. Height, let's do 6,000. So of course you can increase the relative height here. Let's say 100, just for you to see what's going on, so that it's not being affected by the scroll. Now what is being affected by it is you defining left. For example, if you say left is 400 pixels, you get to have that feature there. Note what you have is pushing everything to the left, even the fact that it knows its width. By default the width is 100%. So it's pushing the whole 100% to the right. That you need to put in account on what is happening here when you say left. So let's say left by 10 so that you can see how it's pushing it. Look at the extreme right. Notice that it's pushing it gradually. So if our text was to be a very long text, it will have blocked your view. You will not see what is going on there. So when you are using this, you must put in your mind that you have to use something like width also with it. You have to specify the width so that your content can be visible to the user of what's going on. So let's go ahead and specify our width. Let's say our width is 500. So you can see your width, so you can move it around and then it can make sense to what you are trying to achieve. By the way, before we finish this course, we'll also do a layout using positioning, and then you get to see the difference between float and positioning using positioning. Let's go ahead to play around with other things that we have. So this is left positioning, so you can decide that it's 50 this way. Another thing that you should not forget is we are dealing with a box, so don't forget your margin left, margin right, all those things still apply. So it's possible that you want this to take through the whole page, you want it to take through all the whole page, so you don't want to specify 500, but you still want to push this a little bit. So you still have your margin right, margin left that you can play with. So you could do something like this, and it kind of, works as well. So when you try to move this, you can see what is happening. The whole content is being specified the way you want it to be. So you can also do margin right, and you can have this feature. So you are going to see how you can specify navigation, content later. So this is just using, that's what relative is talking about. Relative is based on the current position, doing your adjustment, that you want to do your positioning, your left, your top, your margin in respect to where it is currently is. It's not affected by your scroll or any other thing, and it's not fixed. It moves around. So let's move on to the next thing that we have, which is absolute. Then the last one is going to be sticky. So absolute is a little bit confusing, but it's very important we take it. Absolute work in conjunction with relative. An element with position absolute is positioned relative to the nearest position ancestor. So meaning the absolute positioning always work in conjunction with relative positioning. That's the best way for you to understand it. So absolute will depend on relative to specify how it should be positioned. Absolute will use relative to depend on where it should be positioned. So the question is, when do you need to use absolute? You need to use absolute when you want to specify elements inside a particular a container like this. You want to have an element inside a container. So let me give you, we always work best with an example. So we already specified that this is a relative content here, and let's say we want everything to be 100% like this. So this is a content, by the way, and then you want to specify an absolute class or absolute position property. And the idea is that you want this absolute property to be able to move based on the content of the relative class. You don't want it to be disturbed by the fact that it's inside a web page. You want it to use the relative content here as its positioning, as its GPRS, as a way to understand how to do its positioning. That's what absolute is all about. Absolute does not use the entire body. It uses only the container that is inside, that is housed inside. So I'm going to create, let's work with one first, then we'll work with the second one. So we already have this as our content. Let's go ahead and start creating our absolute. So if we have our absolute like this, we have our position absolute. Now notice what absolute is doing. If I go ahead and decide my top is going to be based on relative content. So if I say my top is 100%, my top being 100%, notice that it's not going away from relative. The 100% is relative to my relative content here. So let me give you something that you can work with more. So if I say bottom is 0, you can see how the items stay on the bottom of the relative content. Let's increase this to be 300 so that we can see the drama better. Now look at what I'm talking about now. Do you notice what I'm talking about now? Our navigation or our absolute, let me call this absolute for now. Our absolute is totally dependent on our relative content. If, for example, I decide that this relative is no more relative, and I put my absolute, you can see that the absolute is using the total body of the CSS, the body of the HTML, to determine where it should place its content. So you can see that it's using the body, that's this body, because that body now becomes the parent of what it's going to use to determine how it should do its positioning system. So hence you use absolute inside another relative content, just the way I've used it like this. So we have our content, which is supposed to be relative content, and inside relative content you have an absolute where you can decide how the absolute should stay, where it should stay. So we can decide now and say, okay, let's move it left, which by default is left is 0 by default. So if I say right, of course, yeah, as you will see that it will jump to the right hand side of the screen. If I say right 50%, it will come closer to the middle of the screen. Then if I say bottom 50%, let's say top 50%, you expect it to also be in the middle of the screen. So you can see this giving you an idea of how you can even center a text in the middle of a div or a content. This is how you can center. So this can even be an image. You can put an image here. So, but let's go ahead and do some demo of how we can have multiple absolutes inside, where we have. So I'm going to create more absolute div. So I have two sitting side by side here now, but I have to give them different class so that they can behave the way we want them to behave. So I'm going to do a little bit here, a little bit something different, but I'm sure you guys can handle it because we've talked about it before, and that's having multiple class name. So I'm going to remove all this positioning and just call this absolute so that we can move things the way we want them differently. I'm going to create two absolute div containers. One will be for my navigational button and the other one will be for my content. Then I'll call this content. So you can, obviously they're overlapping, that's fine. We're going to move them the way we want them, and that's the idea. But by default, both of them have the absolute positioning system. That's the important thing. Both of them have the absolute positioning, and they are both under the relative positioning as well, which is one of the important things you need to note. They must be under a relative for you to have a effect that you want. If they are not under a relative, you will just have a weird effect, just the way we saw it on the bottom, and when you scroll, it gets scrolled past it. Let's move on. I want to create a nav, and by the way, I'm already creating a template, a layout, a CSS layout. So we have our nav here. I can create our nav class, and what the nav class is going to do for me is allow me to position it to specify the width of what I want to make my navigation. Navigation can also be menu. So I want my width to be, let's say 200, and that's where my menu is going to sit, and it's pretty okay the way it is. You can specify height just for aesthetics, just to see the way it will be. Let's say 200. That's our navigation. The next thing I want to specify is also content. So I'm creating a new content class, and the idea of the content is to move the content forward by, we move it by what? We move it by 200 pixels. You can move it by specifying left 200, so it will be moved by 200. So you can see that it's moving this way. You can move it until you're satisfied with the number that you want it to stay. By the width, so let's say 600. Or let's say 800. Or let's even use percentage. And of course, you can move this until you are satisfied with the content of what you are trying to build. So So this gives you a kind of navigation and content kind of effect, just like what we saw in the previous slide, where you have your top section, your header, your navigation, and then your content. So you can have a kind of height. This is also for aesthetics, but the height and the nav are supposed to build by itself. If you do not specify all those things, they can just come by itself and then increase the page as you have your content inside. So the next thing we have is we left something behind, and that's sticky. So now that we've explained absolute, relative, we can now go to sticky. Sticky allows you to put an item on top, and the idea is that when you scroll past it, it will remain on top. When you scroll back up, it will go back to the initial position that it was on the page. So the best way to show you this is with an example. But the idea of a sticky is such that it's in its initial position until you try to scroll past it. Once you try to scroll past it, it's still on top, sticky to the top, until other things take over it. And you are going to see an example. And again, it works with relative, so that it can have that sticky effect. Let's get to see it in action. Okay, so I'm going to create it at the bottom here. I'm going to create another relative content here. And I have it called relative. Then inside it, I can have content. I can have quite a lot of them. And here I can then create something called sticky class, so that we can go and style it and give it the sticky effects that we want to test. So we come here, we specify sticky position, and we need to specify top. And the idea is that that's to put it on the top of the page, because that's the idea of what sticky is supposed to do. So let's go ahead and give it a try. Before we do that, let's do background so that we can see it's different from other ones. Okay, I think that should differentiate it. So if you try to scroll, as you're scrolling to the page, it's okay, it's looking okay. Then immediately you get to the top, it stays there and waits until once it's out of view of the whole relative container, it goes with it. So let me do that demonstration again, but this time around, let me put it on the top so that you can see it happen to other as it affect other ones. So as it's moving, then it gets to the top. And this is a very good example if you are trying to do table of contents. It's good for table of content, and you might have seen it before. As we do more examples, we might do a real life scenario of this. But this is what is majorly used for. As you scroll past page, because that content is still relevant, it stays on top. And once you are done, it goes away. Pretty much covered all the type of positioning that we have. We've looked at fixed, absolute, relative, static, sticky. Let's look at relative and absolute again, because it also causes some kind of confusion. So it's very good for you to understand the differences between both of them. I mentioned earlier that relative is positioned based on the flow of the elements or the flow of the browser, how it's supposed to work. If you make this item relative, for example, the item is going to use the calculation of the last element, known element, and then detect how it's going to move or how you can place it. But if you are in absolute, if you specify absolute is going to use relative positioning of where it is. It's not going to concern itself with the next item that it has. Look at the next item that it's placed beside it. It doesn't really care. It focuses on the relative that the parent is. That's what it's focusing. Look at what's happening here. The parent is relative, but the item itself is absolute. That's what it's focusing on. So those are the two differences on relative and absolute. So the other part we wanted to talk about is the z-index and overflow. We're going to demo z-index quickly. What z-index does is it allows you to place objects in front of each other. If you notice, as we were going through the system, you will notice that as we are doing the demo, you will notice that some items overlapped each other. So what z-index does is allow you to prioritize another item over another item. So you just set the z-index property and it will know which one to overlap. So let's quickly do that example, and let's assume the navigational overlapped over the contents. Let's make them overlap, the navigation and the content. Let's say background property so that you can see the color of what's happening, and you can decide, you can see it, which one is overlapping which. Let's do that color. And then the content, let's change the color of the content to somewhere here. So let's now try to make them closer, overlap each other. How do you do that? Let's adjust the margin left on this to 200, let's say 200. And from this view, you can see that the content is over the navigational body. Let's even do top so that you're gonna make it more interesting. So you can see that the content is over the navigation menu. So you can decide which one you want to stay on top. So if you want the nav to stay on top, you have to use the z-index. So let's go ahead and set the z-index of navigation nav. The value that must be in the z-index must be the highest of the two of them. What that means is that if one of them is 1, the next one has to be 2. The one that has the highest z-index value becomes the one that will stay on top. So let's set this one to be 10. So because by default every other thing has 1, 1, 1 z-index. So, and again, you can have more than one element overlap each other. So for this case we just have 2. So if you have another box, so you have to specify the z-index for each of them. So let's say the contents now, if I set the z-index to 10 again, you see what happens. They are both the same, but because by default this one is the one that shows last, that's why it's on top. If I set it to be 9, what do you think will happen? It will let the one that has more override it. So that's the idea of what z-index is all about. You will use it when you are working with shapes, or you are working with content that has different overlapping properties. Like if you are doing a dialog box, for example, and one pops up, another one pops up, you will need to know which one should have the higher priority. We will use z-index to make those kind of decisions. The next thing we have is overflow, which is very, very important. You will notice that and I didn't mention it purposely so that we can use this opportunity to talk about it. Let's prepare our content back the way it is, and I will leave the background because it looks kind of nice. So let's leave this one back. Let's remove the top. Let's make this 250 as usual, and let's go ahead and put content inside each of this. Let's provide it with content, and let's see how it works. I'm gonna specify the height of this to be 400 or 500. Okay, let's go ahead and specify the navigational menu here. I think I would like to make it more. Okay, I think it's okay like this. Let's go ahead and set the navigational content here. So let's go ahead. Do you notice what happened to it? It got beyond the container, and that's fine. and we're going to explain that. So this is some link. Instead of just putting homepage, let's just say some link. So this can be some link, linking to a part of a page, and that's the idea what this is supposed to be. But now you've gone beyond the agreed content. Even though on your navigational page you will rarely be scrolling, most of the time it's always full blown. So you can just go ahead and increase. But let me just use this as an example. We'll also use the content to do the second example. So let's go ahead and decide what happened. Notice that in the absolute, as the navigational page, what has happened here is that the content has overflown outside. And how do you then work with this overflow content? There are several things you can do with this overflow content, and which are highlighted here. You can either decide that it's visible, and that's the current state. It's always visible, except to do otherwise. You can decide that you want to hide it. You don't want the user to see it at all. Anything that overflow, you don't want the user to see it. You can decide that you want it to scroll, and that's what obviously we want it to do. And you can say auto, like it should be automatic. It should scroll if it's overflow. It should not scroll if it's not overflowing. So we're going to test out the 4 attributes, the 4 values, and then we're going to see what we have. Because we are dealing with our nav content here, we can go ahead and style it and do our overflow. The property is called overflow. Then we can start with hidden. Merely specify hidden. Whatever get overflow is not visible to anybody. It's just hidden. There will be a place where you need it. Remember in the floats, when we are doing floats, and then there are some things that were going too much, you could actually use the overflow. Okay, so that's the overflow. Overflow here, when you set it to hidden, immediately hides everything that gets overflown out of the container. That's the work of the hidden. Let's move to the next one. And the next one says visible. That's the default. By default is visible, so nothing to do here. Let's move to the next one. The next one is scroll. What that does is that it allows scroll button to show here, irrespective of the fact that it has content or not content. My favorite is auto. Auto is very smart. It checks that it has content, then allows you to scroll. That's the purpose of the auto here. So this might not be a very good use case, but let's go to the content where we'll have content that has to do with this part. And there are more sophisticated features for this. You can specify horizontal scroll and vertical scroll. So let's go to the content and do the same. You can actually come here and load as many content as you want, and then see how the browser is going to behave. So I'm just gonna put some dummy records here, and I'm gonna just continue that until I have overflow. Now that we have overflow, how do you do that? You can repeat what you have here and say overflow. You notice what I said, you can specify if you want to overflow your Y axis or your X axis, but we'll just stick to overflow and specify either of this option. So if you specify auto, it then looks neat like this and allow you to scroll through your content. And that's how you deal with content that is overflowing outside of the container. You use the keyword overflow and it will fix that for you. Let's test our knowledge. We've been able to capture all the 4-5 things on positioning. Let's test our knowledge to play with things and see how we can make use of what we've learned so far. So this is trying to look at what we've learned so far. What I want to do now is move item across. So let me clear everything so that we can see what I want to do. And then I clear all these presettings that we have. So this is like kind of trying to see what we've learned so far, and use that to determine if we've learned anything. So this one is our relative. So what I want to do now is I want to create a kind of a way to I want to place objects. severally on the screen just to show my command of the entire features of what we've learned so far. So first of all, I make this guy relative, and because I want to be able to move things inside it, that's the reason why I'm making it relative. I want to move objects inside here. And so the next thing I want to do is now start bringing in what I want to move around. I want to move this guy to the top. So I want to move to the top left. That's the idea of what I want to do to this guy. I want to move this guy top right. I want to move this to the middle. I want to move this to the bottom left. And I want to move this to the top right. Or bottom. I think we've captured everything. Top left, top right, middle, bottom left, bottom right. I think that's what I want to capture for now. So you can see that all these 4 elements are inside this relative content. We want to move them around. And I told you, in order to do that, you need to make them absolute so that they will be relative to the contents of the relative elements. That's the idea. So we've not created anything. We've not even created the absolute class. Let's go. So I have the relative, and what I need to set here is just to say the positioning is relative. I don't need to specify left or right, even though if I do, it will still work. If I say left, the whole thing will be moved to the left. That's another beauty of this. Once you move everything, whatever is inside, we just move. And you can also specify use margin left, also. So there's an advantage to using margin left in the sense that it makes use of your 100% and it doesn't force you to specify width. So this is using this, and you can place it in center just as we've learned as well. So you can do margin auto, and then you specify width 50%. So we can actually have this kind of effect. So I guess we've learned this one again in our previous classes. So let's move on to what we want to achieve. What we want to achieve is to specify top left. We want to place this guy in top left. And again, to move things around a relative class, we use absolute, because we don't want each of them. We don't want top left, top right, middle, bottom left, bottom right to disturb themselves. We don't want them to care about themselves. And that's where the absolute comes to play. So we will have absolute and absolute. So we style each of them absolute, and we go ahead and give them the positioning absolute position. Absolute position. Immediately you give them the absolute position, look at what happened. All of them stack themselves on each other. They are both depending on relative. It is based on what happens to relative that they are going to follow. They take command from relative in terms of what they take positioning from based on what relative is, what's happening to relative. That's relative container on top, their parent class. So we can individually move each of them to the respective position that we want them to be. So I'm just going to style each of them separately. So I'm going to call this one top left. And the purpose of this is to recap what we've learned so far. So to move this one, you just need to say top is already on top left. I think that's the default position, top left by default. So we don't need to start top left. By default is on top left. So let's move on to the next thing. Let's start the next thing. And the next thing is top right. So let's start top right. Let's call it top right. It's just to specify the right to 0, and it just moves. I mentioned to you, you either use left or right. So when you're specifying right, you move everything to the right. Let's go ahead and style. In fact, I think let's check our top left again, because we want to make sure that it's on absolute left. So let's set the left to be 0. So you can see that it adjusted a little bit. So that's good, because it's using a predefined margin or padding on the relative. So there might be a predefined margin or padding on the relative, so which is here. That's by default they have padding of 10. So it's already inheriting 10 padding. That's why by default is giving that space. So but me setting left to 0, it reset everything and aligns to the relative container. Look at the relative container, that's what it aligns to. Let's move on to the next part, which is middle. So the middle here is to set the top or the bottom to 50%. And not only that, we also set right or left to 50%. There are various ways in which you can achieve this one. You could set margin. Okay, so you could set, we set left to 50%. And it says in the middle. Even though it's not exact middle, I don't want to introduce another thing here, not to confuse you. There's another tag we need to introduce, another property we need to introduce to give it a proper middle. If you look at properly, it's not to middle, it's just where it's starting from is in the middle section. So it's off a little bit, but that's fine for this example. We will introduce the other property in other classes. Next up is we have our bottom right. So let's go ahead and write the other one. Then we have bottom left. Then we have our bottom right. So our bottom right is going to be bottom is 0. Then we specify right to be 0 as well. Goes to the bottom. Then opposites we set for the bottom left. Our left being 0 and our bottom is 0. So you can see I flush to this, and I'm guessing that let's try and set the top to these guys. I'm guessing they need to go up. Let me check if they will go up, or I think it should go up. Let's set that. So top 0. Yep, I thought as much. So let's set this one to top 0. Let's remove the text that says relative. So I already know we are dealing with relative container. Another thing again I want to do is just for us to have a fun time, let's have a background image here and see how the whole thing pans out inside. So let's go to let's pick an image. We don't have any image on this platform. Let me put this image in, and let me just call this BG. So we can have this on relative and say background image. That's a very big image, very big image. So we have background size. Thank you for staying to the end. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and turn on bell notification in order to be notified when we release new videos. See you in the next one. Background positioning, center. Okay, then the top.